Welcome back. So let's get into this discussion now. Gangsterism is one of the key social challenges plaguing the Western Cape province. Young people find themselves in gang rings due to various reasons, and it is almost impossible to escape that life once you're part of a gang. A gang entry and exit in Cape Town, getting beyond the streets in Africa's deadliest city. That's the title of a book based on the life stories of 24 former gang members, as well as hundreds of hours of additional interviews and observations from years of research by Dariusz, Dziewanski, an honorary research affiliate at UCT Center for Criminology. His research found there's a close link, listen to this, between the church and exiting a gang. Most former gang members escaped the gangs through the church. Joining us to tell us more is Dariusz Dziewanski at UCT. Dariusz, a good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. The most fascinating research. I've actually never thought of this. We hear so many times how easy it is for young people to join gangs in some of these really troubled communities, and then you've heard terms in the township that are quite popular, that are, I think the term is, what is it, blood in, blood out, right? And perhaps you can explain that to us. But talk to me firstly about what got you to do this particular research.
Sure, thanks. Sorry, thanks for having me. Like in the rest of the world, there's very little of an emphasis in terms of scholarship on getting out of gangs. And so, I think much like journalists, researchers tend to the more sensational aspects of gang life, so entry, participation, things like this. And it really gives sort of reemphasizes this notion that it is blood in, blood out. So that the blood in refers to the often violent initiations that are required to join a gang. And then this idea that getting out of a gang is also through violence to the person that's in. And then, there's other sort of sayings that are really popularized, like getting into a gang is easy, getting out is impossible. And what I wanted to show through my research is the fact that, that there are ways to get out, and people do it, though it's very difficult. And I wanted to map some of the different mechanisms that people use when getting out.
Yeah, it's interesting. So talk to me about how you went about doing this, because and again, you talk about, journalists and academics and, how we tell certain stories, but it certainly is one thing to be able to get close to those that have lived the reality of being inside of a gang and finding yourself on the outside again.
Yeah, so I had the benefit of first actually engaging through a rehabilitation center, which I guess is one of the things that sort of sparked my interest in the disengagement process. And so there's a rehabilitation center in Strandfontein that I volunteered through. I did sort of like critical life skills sessions through my research, a form of participatory action research. And in that way, I became quite close to some of the people that were leaving and then, re-engaging into the communities. And so what that allowed me is a type of research that was oriented not just through formal interviews and discussions that are like one-off or like twice or thrice off, but I actually was able to follow the lives and the disengagement processes of some of these former gang members for years. And so I really got a sense of their personal struggles, the things that they rely on, really like the dearth of state services that are provided, all of those different structural issues that were present that brought them into gangs, poverty, segregation, lack of empowerment opportunities, lack of access to mainstream social networks, et cetera, and the way that those impeded them or made it more difficult for them to stay out.
I'm curious about and I think we've talked a lot about the factors that lead young men especially to join gangs, and you've just obviously highlighted some of those issues. But once they're inside, as you spoke to some of those that you interviewed, the sense that you got around the wanting to get out, what that looked like, what perhaps there were the factors inside gangs that motivated them to want to leave.
Yeah, I think people actually quite quickly get disenchanted with their notion of what the gang is. I mean, despite the fact that some stay in for many years, it's very difficult to exit. Sorry about that. We have somebody with a motorcycle here. They become aware of the fact that the things that they were promised from the gang in terms of just the material benefits. Gangs are actually quite manipulative. And so when you first come in, they will do their best to sort of, give you some of the benefits, let you smoke more drugs, give you access to money. And so they proactively engage people to come in. And after that, that sort of dries up and you're on your own. And so, there's this idea, because again, what's popularized in the media is sort of the high flyers, the big gang bosses that have lots of money. But most gang members live at the poverty line, are often living without housing, are trapped in cycles of substance, are criminalized, and they end up in prison, and then they're basically abandoned by the gang. It's only their family that visits them, and so they become quite aware very quickly that that the gang life, this brotherhood so-called that they've been promised, isn't actually that, but they're fending for themselves.
Sure, interesting. And we've got a lot to talk about, so I'm really just trying to pick at it, because it's also fascinating. And what you've done is you've also highlighted the fact that, and I said this earlier, a lot of young men, but there are also a lot of female gangsters.
Yeah, that's right. So it didn't come across so much, although females were part of this particular book project. I wrote a separate paper that looked at female participation, not just in gangs, but in gang violence. And so the vast majority of females sort of are they play secondary roles. They're not the ones that are shooting on front lines. They often get in through a boyfriend or a partner. They are often taken on by the gangs to hide drugs, or sometimes where there's a shooting, they will then be given a gun because there's a dearth of police officers, so that they can't be searched. But there are actually some female gang members that act more like men, where they'll use violence as a way of protecting themselves, of getting status in the gang, and differentiating themselves from other females and even other male gang members, to give them that status, that respect, and access to the different opportunities that the gang offers.
Okay, yeah. All right, let's talk about the exit routes that you then have found, because. And when we say blood in, blood out, perhaps we need to explain that a little bit further. You talked about violence being used as a way into the gang, and violence being used as a way out of it. But for many, when we talk about that exit, it does for a lot of people mean the end of their lives. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the really sad things about the research that I did, and the fact that it took place over so many years, as I go back over my interviews, and so many of the people have been killed. I'm not going to put a number to it, but probably, a good half of my original key informants are dead and were killed as a result of gang violence. So it is, the book highlights those cases of people that have, gotten out, and they are success stories, but that is not to sort of underappreciate, I guess, the difficulties and the dangers that people face in being in gangs and even trying to exit. I mean, some people have been killed many, many years after they exited because of those long-standing enmities that people remember. And when you're no longer in the protection of the gang, you're maybe caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, your life really is in danger.
Talk to me about the religious aspect, because it seems that where there's the exit from a gang, somehow, there's a link to the church. Explain that to us. Yeah,
so it's not exclusively the church. It's also the mosque. I think what religion in general does is it acts as sort of a mechanism of absolution. So people that have lived sort of long lives, on the fringe of society and in criminal endeavors, often committing acts of violence, is a way of them sort of, making a break from that, psychologically, socially. It acts as a support network, a community network, a way of just getting those resources that otherwise would potentially be provided by the state that aren't there. I mean, absent of a job, but even then you have maybe sometimes access to a soup kitchen or different types of support that are adjacent to the church. And then the other thing that it does is that it signals to other people that your change is for real. And so one of the things that's sort of accepted in even among gang members is the fact that you may leave gang life for religious life. And so while people are super cynical just because there's so many gang members that have pretended to come out or have gone out and failed and backslid, if you go to church for long enough, if you sort of play the role of the pious man or woman for long enough, eventually that change will be believed, not by other gang members, not just by other gang members, members of your own gang, members of your community, members even of your family, which are also reluctant often to accept your change.
Sure, very interesting. I'm looking at just a few examples in a piece that actually talks about some of your work. And, there's one character that was interviewed, an Emerson, who's 43 years old, was part of a gang called the Americans. And I'm quoting something that he would have said in an interview. He says, "He's standing over me with this brick, and I'm thinking this guy is going to hit me. I just relied on God. His word says no weapon formed against you shall prosper. The Bible tells you about meekness." So it's interesting because you do have people that have lived a life of violence, and their stories then, once they're able to connect them to, I suppose, their spiritual connection, might very well resonate with people.
Yeah, absolutely. And what Scripture does is it provides literally a script by which to act. And I think this, taken in the context of years spent in sort of a cultural space where aggression, hypersensitivity, violence, being the craziest, baddest person out there, are the things that resonate and give you status. How then do you move to something that is the antithesis of that? And you need a moral code, right? And so when you're presented, as Emerson was there, in a situation where your very person and your physical well-being is being put in danger, how do you move away from the things that you would otherwise rely on? So there was another quote that basically highlighted just how quickly he would resort to violence previously, right? And so if that is your natural inclination, then you need something to signal to you to one, act in another way, and to give you a justification for that, right? And so here, in addition to the fact that he quoted the Bible and was given sort of a reassurance that no weapon formed against him would prosper, it also ties into this other aspect, which I think I follow on in that particular article, where he's talking about, well, this is now how I should act now that I'm not a gang member, because people are watching. And so he resorts to violence, and automatically people will start to question his own change and whether or not that's for real, because he's no longer sort of doing the proper performance of the pious man or the religious man.
Sure. Does that protect them, though, from the violence at the end of, I suppose, that life as a gangster, when you have then turned into, and I like the words you used, a pious man, right? Does that protect them from the violence?
No, I mean, it doesn't, obviously. Here, it did. I don't know what sort of like psychological mechanisms were in place where, with Emerson, as he was confronting that robber, maybe the robber was just so dumbfounded by the fact that he had this very meek response. But yeah, generally, you have long-standing battles with enemies, and a lot of times, I think the vast majority of the times, in fact, people are not able to leave the communities that they're in, right? And so they're sort of living in a very small territory that their own gangs are in control of, and to step outside of that is to risk your life. And there's another character in that particular article, and there's many examples in the book of people that, eventually, even years after, would want to sort of expand their life and step out even within their own community in the territory that their enemies control. And, they might run into somebody that they formerly were fighting or shooting with. And the character Patrick, for example, is walking, I think, on a Sunday to church, because that happens to cross, again, American territory. He's a laughing boy, and he runs into one of the bosses of the Americans. And luckily, he says that guy didn't have any weapon on him. He told him that if he did, he would have killed him right there, because Patrick was kind of a high-ranking member of the Laughing Boys, next in line to sort of take over that gang. And despite the fact that he'd been out for many years, those resentments still linger, and those battles and those enmities are still remembered.
Sure. I mean, I want to say fascinating stories, but also heartbreaking when you think about the trap that very young men walk into at a very early age of their lives, and then, of course, later on struggling to get out of that trap. But thank you so much for speaking to us, Dariusz Dziewanski. Tell us, how do we get our hands on the book that you've written? Really, really interesting work that you've done here, Getting Beyond the Streets in Africa's Deadliest City.
Yeah, so there's copies available at the Book Lounge, soon to be available at Clark's Books, both in Cape Town and on Takealot. So if you go to the University of Johannesburg Press, which is the distributing partner for books sold here in South Africa, you can order it online, and there's also digital versions if you're so inclined to read it digitally.
Yeah.